We're going through 1 Samuel and 1 Chronicles right now. We'll be in chapter 16 beginning tonight. So if you want to go ahead and turn to 1 Samuel chapter 16, we'll be there in just a moment. But before we get there, we want to go through our outline as we have each week as we begin our study. We divided the book of 1 Samuel into three major sections. And we do that based on who the main character is. So 1 through 8 is focused on Samuel. 9 through 15 is focused on Saul. And then beginning tonight in chapter 16 and going through the rest of the book, the story is going to be focused on David. And so that's how we divided it up. 1 to 8 Samuel, 9 to 15 Saul, 16 to 31 is David. We're also at the same time going through 1 Chronicles. We divided that into two major sections. 1 through 9 is focused on the genealogies, and 10 through 29 is focused on the reign of David. And we're still in that first section, and so we'll go through that rather quickly. In 1 Chronicles tonight, as we're in chapter 6. 1 Chronicles 6, verses 1 through 30 are focused on the family of Levi. 31 through 48 is a list of those that were serving as musicians in the house of the Lord. 49 through 53 is a list of the family of Aaron. And then 54 through the end of the chapter is a list of dwelling places for the Levites who did not have a land inheritance. And that's what 1 Chronicles 6 is about. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 16. This chapter is where David is anointed as king. Let's go beginning in 1 Samuel chapter 16. This chapter divides itself into two major sections. The first of those is verses 1 through 13, and that is where David is anointed as king. Beginning in verse 1. Now the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." But the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Then invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. You shall anoint for me the one I name to you." And so you remember as we finished up last week, back in chapter 15, what has just happened with Saul? Back in 1 Samuel 15. He's disobeyed God by not destroying all the Amalekites. Remember, he was told to destroy all of them, to leave none of them, and to destroy all of the flocks. But he's kept back the best of the flocks. Remember, they said, well, we're offering this as a sacrifice to God. We're going to offer it as a sacrifice. And so he tried to defend himself. And you have back in chapter 15 all the things that Saul has said, trying to defend himself about how they were the ones who wanted to keep it back. And how we were doing this, but we were going to offer it as a sacrifice, as if that justified what they had done. Remember, he lied and tried to carry it up. I've done all that God commanded me to do. But he had left the very best, and it was told to him that he was rejected as king. He would no longer be king. When he finished, his descendants would not sit on the throne. That's typically how kingdoms will work, and that's what's going to happen with the line of David. Is his children will sit on the throne. He'll follow the descendants. But Saul's will not. Saul will be the last of his family to sit on the throne. And so as he's been rejected, you have Samuel here, who is still in chapter 16, mourning about the fact that Saul has not been the king he needed to be. He's still mourning over the fact that here Saul has been rejected and Saul has not been what he needed to be. That's when the Lord told him to go to the house of Jesse, because I'm going to provide a king from among the sons of Jesse. And so he needs to go and anoint this next king. And so he's told here in verses 1 through 3, you could have quit mourning. Eventually that takes a time, you have to move on. And he's got to move on and get up and get back to work. And so he's going to the house of Jesse. Pick up with me in verse 4. So Samuel did what the Lord said to him, and went to Bethlehem. And the elders of the city, of the town, trembled at his coming and said, "Do you come peaceably?" And he said, "Peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to sacrifice." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So it was when they came that he looked at Eliab and said, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before me," or before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, verse 7, "Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." When they come, really two things about Eliab coming before Samuel. What are the two main things here as Eliab is before Samuel? One's mentioned specifically here, and one we know from others. What is Eliab of the sons of Jesse? He's the eldest son. So typically it would be the oldest son who would be anointed as the king. What else about Eliab makes Samuel think he's the king? His outward features, his appearance. You know, when Eliab comes to him and he looks at him, you can just think that he looks at him and thinks, surely he's the one that's going to be the king. But remember, when you pick somebody that looks the part of the king, Saul looked the part of the king. If they were picking what they would describe as the look of a king, Saul was the look of the king that one would describe. Yet he wasn't what he needed to be. And so this is where the Lord points out to Samuel that he doesn't look at the outward appearance or the physical stature. He may be tall, he may look the part of the king, but the Lord doesn't look at the outward appearance. He looks at what? The heart. It's not about what was outside that was going to make one of the sons of Jesse a good fit to be the king. It was about the heart that one possessed. So Eliab may have looked the part. He may have been the oldest. But the Lord had rejected him because he didn't have the heart that he wanted and who was going to be the next king. Verse 8, so Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, neither the Lord has chosen this one. And Jesse made Shammah pass by. And he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. And Samuel said to Jesse, are all the young men here? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, and there he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send him, bring him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the one. And Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah. So here's Samuel standing, and Jesse sends his sons before him. And 7 sons have passed before Samuel. And none of them are the one the Lord has chosen to be king. So he asked, is there any more? What's Jesse's reply? There's the youngest one. He's still keeping the sheep. You know, I think it's interesting here. When he brings the sons, and one is to be anointed king, you know the one son he does not bring is the one son who it is. It seems that even Jesse didn't think that David would be the one that was going to be king. He has all 7 of the others passed before. David's left out in the field to tend to the sheep. It seems even his father didn't think he would be the one to fit to be king. He was still young. But the Lord chose him to be king because of what? Man after God's own heart. The heart that he possessed was what they needed in a ruler, somebody to lead the people. Because remember, we saw 2 weeks ago, as we were moving through the text, that they were wanting a king to be like the nations around them. But in that, what had they done? They'd rejected God as being the king. Now, when they have a ruler that is somebody after God's own heart, then they're going to be led in the right direction. They're going to have somebody as a ruler that wants to lead them in the right way. Not somebody that might be the best military strategist, though David was a good soldier. Not somebody that looked the part of a strong king, but somebody that was going to be a good ruler because of the heart that they had and the attitude towards worship to God that they possessed. That's what makes David a better king than Saul. When we get to the stories later on, when you get into 2 Samuel and the things that David does, and you compare that to what Saul does, you'll look at it and think, well, surely what David did from the mere human standpoint is worse than what we saw Saul do back in 1 Samuel. But because of the attitude that David possessed, it causes him to have the right reactions to the things that are done when he does wrong. It's because of the heart that he has that leads him to react in the right way. He has this reverence and respect for God. Something that Saul was severely lacking. Saul viewed that, however, if he needed to be the one to offer the sacrifice we saw last week to get the people motivated and ready to go, then he'll be the one to offer the sacrifice. If Samuel's not back, then he'll just do it. It doesn't matter that the Lord won't allow him to do that. He's going to do it. And ultimately shows a lack of reverence and respect to God. But that's not what David possesses. David is somebody after God's own heart. He's somebody that reverences and respects God. And so this is the one chosen to be king. The one who, even his own father, it seems, didn't think was going to be king. But he is the one who is the next king. It's a good point. Him being physically a shepherd and a representation that Jesus is the good shepherd, as we see when we get into John. It's a good point. Beginning at verse 14 and going through the end of this text is this distressing spirit that comes upon Saul. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, verse 14, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servant said to him, surely a distressing spirit from God is troubling you. Let our master now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is a skillful player of the harp, and it shall be that he will play with his hand when the distressing spirit from God is upon you, and you shall be well. So Saul said to his servants, provide me now a man who can play well, and bring him to me. Then one of the servants answered and said, look, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and handsome person, and the Lord is with him. Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David, who is with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey, loaded it with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them by his son David to Saul. So David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor-bearer. Then Saul sent to Jesse, saying, please let David stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. And so it was, whenever the Spirit from God was upon Saul, that David would take a harp and play it with his hand. Then Saul would become refreshed and well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him. Here we have this distressing spirit that comes upon Saul, and David's found to come and play the harp to sort of relax Saul and to take this distressing spirit away. I think it's important we note verse 18 in this. Verse 18, where when you look at the reputation of David already, aside from the fact that he's a skillful player of the harp, he's a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, handsome person, and the Lord is with him. Even the people that were serving Saul understood the Lord was with David. They may not have understood at this fact that David was anointed as the next king, but they understand the Lord is with David. They understand that he's a man that's prudent in speech. You think of the reputation that David already had back here in chapter 16, long before we get to know the man that we will follow over the next several chapters through the rest of this book and on through the next one. This is the reputation that he already has as a young person. Man, prudent in speech and somebody that the Lord is with. That tells us something about David and because of the reputation that went before him. But, this distressing spirit comes upon Saul, and so David comes and he plays the harp for him. And Saul, the distressing spirit, leaves Saul. In chapter 17, let's move on to chapter 17 now. So, chapter 17, it's a lengthy chapter, but this is a very important story in the life of David. Because this is the first great example of faith we'll have in the life of David, is the story of David and Goliath. And this text, it divides itself into three major sections. The first of those being 1 to 19. This is Goliath's challenge. He's challenging the people of Israel. Look, beginning at verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephes Dammim, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. You think, as you read through the description of Goliath here, and just forget his physical appearance for the second and how tall he is and how frightening that would be alone, here's a man that is in all this armor as well. Carries this large spear and javelin with him. And so when he comes out and he challenges the people of Israel, the Israelites are afraid and greatly dismayed, according to verse 11. When you think about it from a physical standpoint, if somebody the size of Goliath, about 9.5 feet tall, came standing in and challenged you to a physical hand-to-hand fight, you'd be afraid too. Who'd want to stand up and fight a giant? Who would want to go out and fight somebody of that size? And so as he comes out and challenges them, Israel is greatly afraid. Look at verse 12. Now David, son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. The man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of the 3 sons of the battle were Eliab the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and then Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. And Jesse said to his son David, "Take now your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So here, David has gone back to tend to the sheep, and Jesse sends him to take things to his brothers and come back and tell me how things are going. Verse 20 through verse 30, here's going to be where David is going to accept the challenge that Goliath is given. Beginning of verse 20. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words, so David heard them. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. Verse 26, then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is the uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? You think about David's focus here. Here you have this champion coming out, and here you have all these soldiers there. And as this champion comes out and is challenging them, time and time again, he's coming out for 40 days and he's challenging them. They are afraid and dismayed. But here comes David, bringing the supplies to his brother. He runs out to see his brothers, and here comes Goliath, speaking the same words we read earlier in the text. While the rest of the army, the trained soldiers, are afraid, look at David's response again. What shall be done, verse 26, for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is the uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Israel's the people of God, and here this Philistine is coming out and challenging them, and the soldiers are standing by, and David's response is, who's going to take away this reproach? He's coming out and challenging you day after day. Here are the people that are serving the living God. Here are the people that God has delivered them out of the hands of the Egyptians. Here's the God that has delivered them time and time again as you move throughout, as they wander in the wilderness, as they come into the land and defeat nations stronger and mightier than they are. Remember that Gideon and the 300 men that went with him? Remember all the times that they had a much smaller army and they were victorious because God was on their side. And here this champion is coming out and challenging them, and they stand there afraid. They weren't understanding that God would be with them. But here they're challenging the people of God, challenging the armies of God, and here David wants to know who's going to deal with this problem. You can't just stand by and let this keep happening day after day. And the people answered, verse 27, him in this manner, so it shall be done for the man who kills him, telling him what had been discussed previously. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why did you come down here, and with whom have you left the few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and these people answered him as the first ones did. Let's pick up in verse 31. This is going to be where the fight's going to take place, and then the challenge that Goliath has given to Israel will be, that we see is going to be answered by David, that David will prove victorious. Pick up in verse 31. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight the Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. So here Saul's looking at it, and David says, I will go fight him. Nobody else, but I'll go fight him. Saul's reply is, you're still young, and he's been trained to be a soldier from the time he was young. Listen to David's reply. Your servant, verse 34, used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth, and when it rose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. His focus is upon the fact that he's defying the armies of God, and so God will be with David. He's killed lion and bear, and so as the lion and the bear have been killed, so will this Philistine soldier be. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me, verse 37, from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, He will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. David's answer again is focused on the fact that the Lord will be with him. He was victorious against the lion and the bear because the Lord was with him. He will prove victorious over the Philistine because the Lord will be with him. Skip down with me down here to verse 40. So after they've tried to put the armor on him in the verses before, and the Saul's armor, and that it doesn't fit, he takes it off, and so he takes, verse 40, a staff in his hand, and chooses for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, put them in a shepherd's bag, and a pouch which he had, and a sling in his hand, and he drew near the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you have come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Goliath sees David as no threat. From what we know historically and everything, David probably stood about 5'5"-ish. Goliath stands around 9 feet. That's a big difference. And so you're standing in Goliath's shoes and David comes out, and it would be like for an adult, a little kid coming out, and you would think they're no threat. That's about the size difference between Goliath and David, and Goliath is laughing. Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? I'm going to feed your flesh to the birds of the air. But listen to David. Remember, just the challenge alone is scaring the people of Israel, and all the armies are dismayed. Here's David's response. You come to me, verse 45, with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcass of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hands. Here you have this mighty warrior in Goliath who comes out with all his weapons. And here comes a little shepherd boy with a sling and some stones. And Goliath, as he views him as no threat, David answers him, not that I have a sling with stones. That doesn't sound like a very threatening weapon. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. He makes the point that you have the sword and spear, but that God will give you into my hands. And we sing a song based off of verse 47. The battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hands. We sing a song based on that sometimes. The battle belongs to the Lord. David understood that it wasn't about the size of Goliath or the size of an army. It was about the Lord being with them. So in verse 48, the Philistine arose and came to draw near to meet David, and David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in the bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose, verse 52, and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley of the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Sharon, even as far as Gath and Ekron. So as you move throughout this text, you notice here are the Israelites who were afraid, and when David goes out and he kills the champion of the Philistines have already realized they are not going to win. If a little shepherd boy could kill the giant that he came out to fight, then how does the rest of these men stand against an entire army? If the Lord is with them, then how could the Philistines be victorious? The Philistines didn't understand that. When Goliath fell, they fled. And now Israel is emboldened, as now the people, once afraid, will pursue the Philistines in battle. You see the motivation that came about by David going out there? They now realize, just as David said, the battle is the Lord's and He will give it to whom He wills. And so it was done that day as Goliath was defeated at the hands of David. Let's move on to chapter 18. 1Samuel chapter 18. Verses 1 to 4 dealing with the friendship of Jonathan and David. When he had finished speaking to Saul, talking about the rest of what is in chapter 17, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And so Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. And then Jonathan made a covenant because he loved him, and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off his robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. So this tells there's this close friendship between Jonathan and David. We'll see more about that in just a moment. But in chapter 18, for time's sake, we'll just hit some of the highlights here real quick. Notice 5 through 7. David went out whenever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now it happened as they were going home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out of the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain thousands, and David has 10,000s. See, verses 5 to 7 here, and the praise of David by these women and the song they sing is part of the motivation for what's fixing to take place. Because according to verse 9, Saul eyed David from that day forward. And so it happened in verse 10. This is where we're going to have the first occasion where Saul's going to be angered and he's going to try and pin David to the wall. And it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand as at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul here now understands that the Spirit of the Lord has departed from him, and the Lord is with David. He is jealous of David, and he tries to pin him to the wall. As the women are singing the praise in verses 5 through 8, it's closely connected with the fact that he's eyeing him in verse 9. And because in verse 9, he's eyeing him, he's keeping his eye on David, and he's now understanding the Lord is with him, that when he has opportunity, he tries to kill David. You come on down to verse 17, this is where David's going to marry Michal. But it's important to note here that Saul said, here's my oldest daughter, Merab, verse 17. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. Now, Saul's trying to think strategically here. People love David. If I kill David, that's not going to be very good. But if I can send him out in battle and let the Philistines kill him, then the people aren't mad at me, and I get rid of David at the same time. He thought it was a win-win scenario for him. So David said in verse 18, "Who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" But it happened at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel the Mahalite as a wife. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So Saul said, "I will give him to her to him," verse 21, "that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Therefore Saul said to David a second time, "You shall be my son-in-law today." Saul commanded his servants, "Communicate with David secretly and say, 'Look, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law.'" So Saul's servants spoke these words in the hearing of David. And David said, "Does it seem to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing I am poor and lightly esteemed man?" And the servants of Saul said to him, Saul saying in the manner David spoke. Then Saul said, "Thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies." But Saul thought that to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So here Saul's going to send him out. "Oh, no. We're not expecting any dowry except 100 these foreskins, or 100 foreskins of the Philistines." And the thought is, if David goes out and fights them, then he's going to die. But as the story goes on, David returns with 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And Saul has to give Michal to David to be his wife. But again, Saul was trying to get the Philistines to kill David so he didn't have to, and the people wouldn't be as angry with him. Let's move on into 19, as our time is what time we have remaining. Let's try and we'll hit the highlights of 19 and 20. 19, Saul's going to try and persecute David. He's still trying to kill him, and so in verse 1, Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and to his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. Remember, we just saw back in chapter 18 that Jonathan and David had a close friendship, and Jonathan loved David as himself. There's a close friendship there. So Jonathan's wants to keep him safe. So Jonathan tells David in verse 2, "My father Saul seeks to kill you. So be on your guard in the morning and stay in the place and hide. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you. Then what I observe I will tell you." So Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul in verse 4, his father, and said, "Let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his works have been very good toward you. For he took his life in his hands and killed the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without a cause?" So Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, "As the Lord lives, he shall not be killed." Jonathan points out here to his father, "Listen, why would you seek to kill him? He's not done you any harm. He's not sinned against you. In fact, what he has done has been good for you." So Saul swears he will not kill him. But in verse 9, a dissenting spirit comes upon Saul. David's playing music for him, and so in verse 10, Saul sought to pin David to the wall with a spear, but he slipped away from Saul's presence and drove the spear into the wall. So David fled and escaped that night. And so he tries again here in chapter 19 to pin David to the wall and kill him. He swore he would not kill him, but he did not keep his word. He did try and kill him later on again. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 20, we have Jonathan's loyalty to David about the friendship, but we also see this is where we know at this point there is not going to be, Saul's not going to be willing to tolerate David. He wants to kill him. Beginning at verse 1. Then David fled from Naioth and Ramah and went up and said to Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" And Jonathan said to him, "By no means you shall not die. Indeed, my father will do nothing either great or small without first telling me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so." Then David took an oath again and said, "Your father certainly knows that I have found favor in your eyes. And he has said, 'Do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved.' But truly, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death." Jonathan said to David in verse 4, "Whatever you yourself desire, I will do it for you." So he tells him, tomorrow's the new moon, tomorrow's the feast. You're going to go to the feast with your father, where David's supposed to be as well, there with Saul and Jonathan. And you're going to mention that I went back to Bethlehem for the yearly sacrifice with my family. If your father's reply is, according to verse 7, it is well, your servant is safe. But if he is very angry, be sure that evil is determined by him. And so, here they've made this covenant in 1 and 23. Now skip down to verse 24. So David's hid in the field, and the new moon had come. Remember, just as David said, when the new moon, at this feast at the new moon, that's when Jonathan's going to talk to Saul. That he's hiding in the field, and as the king sat on his seat, as at other times on a seat by the wall, and Jonathan arose, and Abner sat by Saul, but David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul did not say anything that day, for he thought something has happened to him. He is unclean. Surely he's unclean. He's not here. He must be unclean. Something's happened. So Saul's thinking, that's why David's not here. So he's not saying anything the first day. And it happened the next day, the second day of the month, that David's place was empty. And Saul said to Jonathan his son, why has the son of David, or the son of Jesse, not come to eat either yesterday or today? Okay, yesterday maybe he was unclean, but he's not here today either. Why is that, Jonathan? Verse 28, David earnestly asked permission of me to go to Bethlehem. And he said, please let me go, for our family has a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to be there. And now if I have found favor in your eyes, please let me get away and see my brothers. Therefore he has not come to the king's table. So remember, if Saul's reply is it is well, then he's not seeking to kill David. If he gets angry, he's seeking to kill David. Here's how angry Saul gets in verse 30. This is what he says to Jonathan. You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. Not only does Saul know that people like David better than him, as long as David lives, when Saul dies, Jonathan will never be king. And he wants to know, Jonathan, why are you showing favor to him? And so he tries to kill Jonathan, and Jonathan flees. And then in verse 34 through 42 is a sad scene as Jonathan and David will depart from one another. As it's made known from Jonathan lets David know that, yes, he seeks to kill you, and David has to go on the run, and they won't see each other again. Now, we've run through that rather quickly, but in the last few minutes we have remaining, let's talk about some practical lessons. What are some practical lessons you see as we move through these chapters? Yes. Right. He had faith that God will take care of him. And from our standpoint, down here to point number 2, that the battle is the Lord's, where He has the faith in it. We may not physically be fighting giants, but we'll face some fights that we think are pretty gigantic, and we can't overcome. But we have to remember that as long as the Lord is on our side, we will be victorious. And while, again, it's not a physical fight like David was fighting, we've got to understand that, because unless we do, then we're going to be dismayed just like the armies of Israel. And even though God was with them, they were dismayed and were not willing to fight. But we've got to have the attitude of David, where we understand that if the Lord is on our side, then we can be victorious, and the battle is the Lord's. What else do we see in this text? Back here in chapter 16, this don't judge a book by its cover. Samuel thought that Eliab should be king. He sort of looked the part, and he was the oldest. But it wasn't him. It was the youngest, the one that, again, his father, that even David's own father didn't seem to think was the one going to be king. But that was the one who the Lord had chosen. We don't judge a book by its cover. While it may look one way on the outside, it may really be something else. That's important for us to understand.
Another thing is, David was not afraid to take the challenge against Goliath.
Yeah, he's not. He wasn't fearful because of the faith that he had. Chapters 18 and 20, I think, show us the importance of friendship. If it wasn't for Jonathan and what Jonathan has done for David, then there would have been more opportunities for Saul to have killed him. And finally, we see jealousy is a powerful thing. The jealousy of Saul is what ultimately led him to trying to kill David the first time and led him to continuously try and kill David. And so jealousy can be a powerful thing. We'll study next week 21 through 24 of 1 Samuel and then 1 Chronicles 7.